Hello, hello. It is Justin Coletti of SonicScoop, and thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the SonicScoop podcast. And today, we are going to be going into a track that has been brought up by a whole lot of people as a reference for me in recent years. But this is a super old track. This is a track from the 1970s. This track, I get why people reference it. It is gorgeous sounding in so many ways, and we're going to be exploring a few things, in particular, its use of reverb, but we'll also be exploring different remasters of this song done in different years. Because the version of this record that you might be familiar with may sound totally different than the original version of this record that people were first vibing out to when it came out. The record here is Fleetwood Mac's Rumors, and in particular, the song Dreams, which is brought up as a Sonic reference today, I think, more than the other tracks on this album. It's been streamed on Spotify alone more than almost 2 billion times or something like that. And I can't tell you which version is the most popular, as there's a few different masters, and we'll listen to the different masters. But they all three of these masters together, you find them on Spotify. You'll find the original master, a 2004 master, and a 2018 master, all of which sound substantially different, but they have the same view count for each. So I don't know which one has been heard the most. But there's a good chance that the version of this record that you heard isn't the same as records that other people have heard. And we'll get to hear a lot about what mastering can do to a mix today when we're evaluating, because there are some substantial changes, especially when you compare the 2004 remaster of this record to the original, and this will give us great insights into what mastering can and can't do to a mix. So with all that out of the way, we can dive pretty straight into listening to this track. The only thing I've got to give you is the briefest of shout outs to our sponsors. Who are sponsors? The most important sponsor on this podcast, as always, is you. How do you sponsor it? Hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, leave a comment, hit me in the live chat if you're here for the live premiere of this. Thanks to all you guys for joining me. Skeleton Pete, Liam, Andre, William. Good to have so many of you here joining us. John. All right. And another thing you can do is, if you really want to sponsor this podcast, the best thing you can do is sponsor yourself by checking out one of our great full-length courses like Mixing Breakthroughs, Mastering Demystified, Compression Breakthroughs, EQ Breakthroughs, or you can join our members section over at members.sonicscoop.com, where you can check out all of our full-length courses and become a member, where we can do mix breakdowns on your own work, giving you really concrete, great feedback on your mixes, find you the lowest hanging fruit to address, I should say, in your own records. All right. Last quick shout out is sponsors, Sound Toys, sponsoring this podcast in the beginning, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe. Try out anything they make for free for 30 days over at soundtoys.com. And I've got to say, their Superplate plugin is probably one of the best plugins you could potentially use to get a sound like the reverb sound that we're going to be talking about today. So definitely check out Superplate or Little Plate if you haven't already. All right, without any further ado, let's get right into it. I'm going to start off by playing the 2004 master, which is probably the biggest and in some ways maybe most impressive sounding of the masters. And we'll listen to that one for a while. We'll get some ideas about what's working in the mix, what is prioritized in the mix. And then after we've really acclimated ourselves to it, I'll go back and play you two different versions of the master. Here we are. This is the track from Fleetwood Mac's Rumors called Dreams, 2004 version. Here we go. All right, I'm going to stop it there for now because I just want to focus in on this section. So a couple of things that are interesting to note here. I mean, this is such a remarkably tight drum and bass rhythm, especially for the mid-1970s. And one of the reasons it's so remarkably tight is that this is actually a drum loop. Yes, they were doing that in the 1970s. This, according to the producer of this record, is about an 8-bar drum loop that goes for almost the entire song, about 4 minutes long, is practically the same drum groove the entire time. And I think that was part of the success of this song and some of the songs on this record. It's just so hypnotically tight. There's this machine-like quality, but there's still a human element to it, where it is not like 100% quantized to the grid, but it's pretty darn tight. And we're taking this, getting a little bit of the best of both worlds, where there's a little bit of humanity in this performance, but it's like the best chunk of this performance looped again and again. And this probably isn't something you were thinking they'd be doing in records in the 1970s, but it absolutely is. In the 70s, and then even more so in the 80s, and then by the 90s, there is so much rhythmic doctoring going on major releases. And this can be one of the things that separates your record from the sound of major commercial releases, is how tight is it rhythmically. Now, is every single major release from the mid-70s or the 80s onwards like all 100% on a grid? No. But are most of them? Kinda, yeah. So if you are nervous about the idea of doing some doctoring to your drum sounds because you think it's inauthentic, most people don't think of the record Rumors by Fleetwood Mac as being inauthentic, or overly modern sounding. To most people, you're going to hear this record and you say, oh man, they don't make records like this anymore. It's so human and there's such feel here. And it's like, yeah, there's also an 8-bar drum loop happening here. So recognize that. Now, there are times where there's certain types of performers and certain types of feels where you don't want to quantize that stuff at all. You don't want to use loops at all. There's certain types of records where you just don't want to do that. I'm a big fan of the Daptones records, if you're into Sharon Jones and the Dap Kings or Budo's band, and a whole bunch of the stuff that came out of the Daptone scene. That stuff is so much more lightly edited, if at all. And there's great hits that are unedited, particularly from the 60s. But you're also allowed to do this, and it doesn't make your stuff sound inauthentic, and you're not necessarily cheating to do it. So that's one thing I want to get out of the way. The second big thing here is just the use of reverb here is so masterful. And how do they get away with such a big, long reverb that doesn't draw attention to itself? And we'll talk about a few of the techniques there. But one of the other reasons I think this track comes up again and again for people as a sonic reference is that almost every element in the track sounds big at once. And how are they able to do that? I have this tier theory when it comes to tracks. And I think one of the biggest things in a mix is to recognize that you can't have everything all be the loudest thing all at once. Basically impossible. You can really have one or two elements that are kind of in your A tier, that are the loudest, most prominent elements in any one given section or moment of a song. And then you have the B tier, the one or two elements that are kind of second fiddle almost. They are the supporting elements that are just under our A tier elements. And then there's C tier, that's everything else. But sometimes we can give the illusion that everything can be loud all at once if either one, they take turns, and that's something that happens a lot in tracks, or two, we can get closer and closer to making more items sound big if we have only a few items. And listen to the arrangement here. Listen to how few elements there are. But also, when we say that so many elements in this sound big, there's a few elements that are allowed to sound very, very small. So I want you to listen to this intro again, and first notice what sounds biggest to you. But then, shortly after that, give me your list for what sounds smallest in this mix and what's allowed to be dwarfed in this mix, because that is crucially important in establishing the size of the biggest sounding elements. Here it is again from the top. Oh, first of all, how crisp is that snare sound? And then the reverb on that snare sound is a similar thing going on to the reverb on the vocal. We'll talk about that in a second. So there's so many big elements, and depending on what you want to focus on, you could say, oh man, the kick, the snare, and the hi-hat are some of the most prominent elements in this mix. But every once in a while, the vocal, this is very dynamic vocal for records of today. Like you wouldn't hear a vocal with this much dynamic range in it in most major hits today. Every once in a while, the vocal gets loud enough to kind of overtake and become like A-tier element, and then it fades back into B-tier. So the vocal is kind of poking in and out from being A-tier and B-tier element. There's this dynamic movement in the vocal that is, we don't hear enough of today, but totally works in this kind of sparse mix. And then another interesting thing that happens is that there are times in the beginning where we're taking turns. The guitar is actually really big in the beginning, but later on, once the vocal starts to become the main character, the guitar kind of drops into the background. So there's this idea of taking turns where, because in the intro section was just drums, bass, and guitar, the guitar swells are actually really big. But then the vocals are kind of allowed to replace and overtake the guitar's position in the mix. And then the guitar takes a little bit of a backseat to the vocals. But there's also some elements in here that are just decidedly C-tier. There's, for instance, a Fender Rhodes kind of keyboard sound in the background. It's like this quietest thing in the mix. If you listen for it out here, you'll hear it. But does it have anywhere near the size of any of the other elements in the mix? Listen right around here. Do you hear that, Rhodes? It's a little bit towards the left, really muted and veiled and dark on top. And one of the reasons they're able to get away with such brightness in the snare attack, in the hi-hat, in the vocal sound, is they're allowing there to be some elements that are really muted on top. And the most muted element here is absolutely the Fender Rhodes. And also, secondly, some of these guitar lines are just taking a lot of top end off of them. So part of what makes the hi-hat, the snare, the reverb sound so crisp is that there's really dark elements in the mix. The top end of the guitar and the top end of the Rhodes that kind of highlight the brightness of some of the elements that are allowed to sound crisp. If you try to make the Fender Rhodes in this and the guitar in this as equally bright as all the other elements, the entire mix would just sound harsh and annoying. So you've kind of got to pick and choose to a degree. There can be some elements that are bright, and if you try to make them all bright, then none of the elements stand out as particularly bright and clear and crisp. So the other thing I want to focus on here with you is the reverb on this track. And here, the big things for me are, one, this reverb is long, and there's a long pre-delay, and I would consider this a mid-rangey, bright reverb. There is not a huge amount of extreme top end on this reverb. So we're rolling off some top, but even more so, we're rolling off a ton of low. And I think we can hear this even more so if we listen to the isolated vocals. I often don't play isolated tracks on these live streams, but I think this is one where it's useful to hear the vocal and the reverb together. So here it is isolated. I'm not exactly sure how this isolation was done, so there might be some artifacting in it. But let's hear just the isolated vocal track here. Here we go.
Now here you go again, you say you want your freedom. Well, who am I to keep you down?
Now, my guess here is that this is a plate. It could be a heavily EQ'd chamber, but I think that's extremely unlikely. This is the days before digital reverbs. I think this track is like 1976, so it pretty much would have to be a plate, a chamber, maybe a spring, natural room reverb. Those are kind of our options. And out of those, the only things that are going to be possibly give us this kind of sound would either be most likely a plate and less likely a chamber, but it could be if it's really heavily EQ'd. Sometimes reverb types, when there's a ton of EQ on them, can kind of blend together. But I would peg this as probably being an EMT plate reverb. But there's almost certainly significant delay on here, kind of separating the reverb from the original vocal. And this would not be a pre-delay of like 20 milliseconds or something. Pre-delays that are 10 milliseconds, 20 milliseconds, 30 milliseconds, they almost don't matter. The pre-delays that we really hear on reverbs are ones that are long enough to start to separate the reverb from the rest of the sound. And that, because of something called the Haas effect, It just means that if sounds are really, really close together, they sound like they're part of the original sound. Once pre-delays get to like 40, 50 milliseconds at least, and definitely when we get to 60, 70, 80, and 100 milliseconds, that's where we really hear the reverb start to separate from the original vocal, and it's almost like an echo, a delayed reverb kind of effect. And that's absolutely something that's going on here. We can hear the reverb in time separate from the vocal. So part of what's going on is a fairly long reverb. I don't know exactly. I would say at least 1.5 to 2.5 seconds, probably in that range. It's my guess, but it's hard to know exactly. There's different things that can affect the length of a reverb. A reverb could be 1.5 seconds RT60 time, but then if you have compression on the reverb that brings up the tail, it sounds like a longer reverb. So it's hard to be precise about these things. But my guess is our reverb here is probably at least like 1.5 seconds, maybe longer. But what makes it seem so long is not just the length of it. It could be shorter than that, but the pre-delay adds to the length of the reverb. And one of the great things about using a pre-delay that really separates the sound of the reverb from the sound of the dry vocal is that you can use less and less reverb, but have that reverb have more of an effect, be more prominent. So one of the big problems I hear in a lot of beginner and intermediate mixes is they'll use pre-delays that are either non-existent or they've heard like, oh, pre-delay can be useful. So they put on like 20 milliseconds of pre-delay, and then they have a ton of reverb. They don't EQ the reverb return at all. And the thing is like swimming in reverb. But this track isn't swimming in reverb. It has a reverb that's separated from the original sound. So even when you use a really small amount of it, it has a substantial effect. Now that I've described that idea to you, listen to this reverb again and tell me exactly what you hear.
It's only right that you should play the way you feel it. But listen carefully to the sound of the loneliness like a heartbeat.
Now, I think I hear some artifacting in here. I'm not sure how they isolated these vocals because I hear some artifacts in the reverb. So we're not really maybe hearing the exact full length of the reverb that would really be there. But what I hear here is, again, the separation between the initial vocal line and the reverb after it. And also, I would call this like mid-rangey bright in the sense that maybe that's not even fair to call it mid-rangey bright. It's just mid-rangey. The best reverb sounds where you can get away with using a lot of them are reverb sounds where you chop off a ton of high frequency and a ton of low frequency. And I think if we were able to isolate just the reverb, I'm doubting that there's much of anything above 8K on the reverb, and it's probably starting to roll off below that. I also doubt there's much of anything below 200 hertz on this reverb return. Let's listen to a little more. Ooh, a little further backwards, a solo vocal.
Now here you go again, you say you want your freedom.
Like all the brightness and articulation in the reverb is coming from somewhere in the center mids. What are the most important frequencies in this reverb? I don't know. It's like from most of its energy is between like 500 hertz and 3K maybe. And I doubt there's very much above, 4K, 5K, 6K. And I doubt there's very much below, 300, 200, 100. So this is a big thing. If you want this kind of reverb sound, you can go longer with reverb if you separate it from the rest of the vocal and if you kind of EQ down the top and the bottom. And then you'll find that you actually don't need to make the reverb as long. It doesn't need to be a 3 or 4 or 5 second reverb to sound extremely long if you're doing these things. And you don't actually need the thing to be swimming in reverb if you're giving it this kind of presence from mid-range and separating from the initial track. I also want to explore with you the huge, huge difference between the low frequencies in the 2004 remaster we've been listening to and the original 1976 master. And there's probably more than one version of the original 1976 master. So here's our 2004 again. Let's rock out of this a little bit. Such a big bottom, right? Luscious. All right, now let's go back to 1976. Ready? Right? We just lost the entire bottom register. Now, in this mix, what are the most prominent things? It's actually the same mix, just remastered. All of a sudden, the kick drum takes much more of a backseat. And this becomes much more like a 1970s recording aesthetic, which is kick drum is there, but the kick drum is actually relatively bright compared to the bass drum. So we kind of have a knocky, mid-rangey kick drum. I believe this kick drum mic, if I remember correctly, it's a Sennheiser MD421, like right inside the kick. And then there's probably a bunch of EQ on it to brighten it up so it's not just all 400 hertz, which is what that mic would sound like if you didn't brighten it. But it's a very classic 70s sound. Listen to the kind of, there's definition and snap and thud on the kick without it being overly clicky. But then the bass is kind of like undergirding the kick. But relative to a 2004 remaster, there's like almost no low end on this record. And to be even more fair, I'll turn this record up a little bit. This is it turned up. Now 2004. Right? Totally different bottom end. 76. Okay, so which one do you like better? They're totally different, right? And even if I try to be even more fair, I'm going to turn up 1976 another couple dB, turn down 2004 a little bit more, still just totally different sound. I mean, it practically sounds like a remix, this 2004 version. Although to my understanding, it's not. It's a remaster. And this is potentially how far you can take things in mastering. I've definitely done in my mastering work before and afters that sound like this. There are certain clients for whom I would never do this dramatic of before and after in mastering. And there are certain clients for whom I definitely would. Honestly, some of my favorite masters that I've ever done are ones where I've done the least. And there's just a really, really good mix. And the person took it to me because they knew I wouldn't try to fix what's not broken. And I practically leave the thing alone, enhance it a little bit, and make the songs fit better next to one another. And there's also some masters that I've loved that I've done, including at least one that went platinum, where I did significantly change a mix from being kind of mid-rangey to big and impressive and massive and wide, which is the big difference here between the 76 and the 2004. That said, out of all the masters that I was listening to, I kind of like this 2018 one. This 2018 one strikes a nice balance between the 2004 version and the original version, because it has some of the bigness of the new one without adding like this huge bottom end to the kick drum that isn't normal for a 1970s record. Here, let's listen to a little bit of 2008 and I'll kind of flip between them again. It's 2008. Or sorry, 2018. Versus the original. I kind of like this 2018. You know, it sounds closer to the original with some of the beef and fullness of the 2004, but without doing this. This is the 2004. Huge bottom. '76. 2018, 2004. I have to admit that this 2004, I mean, if you just do a quick sip test like this, it is the biggest, baddest, most immersive. And this is the funny thing about actually mixing and mastering is that this 2004 version, there's nothing about it that is more pure, more hi-fi in a literal sense, more close to the original source. Like everything about this 2004 version and the 2018 to a degree we're distorting it relative to what it originally sounded like. And I'm using the term distortion here very loosely, not to just mean total harmonic distortion, but also EQ, stereo widening, all the stuff. The 2004 and the 2018 are so far from what the original mix would have sounded like coming off the console. But they, in a way, sound more quote-unquote hi-fi to us because they sound bigger, taller, deeper, wider, more impressive. And the way that that is done is by messing up the sound. By EQing it, by adding saturation, by adding weird dynamics processing, by adding weird spatializers that all monkey around with and mess up the sound in ways that just make it sound more big and awesome and badass. And even if the 2004 version goes too far for you, it does for me a tiny bit in the low end. I just want to tamper down the low end just a tiny bit. So it's a little bit less trying to just prove how cool we can make the low end in the 2004 remaster. And if it was just trying a little bit less hard, I think that would almost be my favorite version out of these. But the 1970s version, as big as it was then, if you came out with a record that sounded like this 1976 one today, you'd probably be disappointed in yourself and how the sound was. That said, this record has sold like 42 million copies, and many of those happened most of those probably happened between 1976 and 2004. Although I don't know, there's a chance that in the past 20 years, it sold as many copies as it did in the first 20 years that it was out. But hopefully you can hear some of those giant differences. Let's take it to a slightly more dense section. And just to try to be a little bit more fair, I'm going to turn everything down a little bit to make sure I'm not hitting any additional limiting. And here is our original. 2018. And 2004. Whoa. I mean, listen to the bottom end disappear on the 76 and listen to how thin and transient-y that acoustic guitar is. And this is funny, and here I want to tell you a personal story because I was not a big Fleetwood Mac fan growing up. I think my dad probably had, their albums. I definitely heard this stuff, as a kid in the 80s and the 90s. But I remember listening to them and not really getting it. And first of all, they sound like some really awful, dysfunctional people. But even beyond that, I was also like, where's the song? Like, it was something I never got listening to a song like this. I'm like, where's the song? There's no song here. Now, I'm being harsh and critical. This is not exactly the way I feel about it now, but I remember that being my perception. It's like, where's the song? I'm listening to this Dreams thing. I hear strummy acoustic guitar. I hear rhythm section happening. Somebody's singing, but there's just two chords back and forth. It's not a song. It's like a meditation almost. Okay. And I just didn't get it. But then I remember hearing this in the studio on really nice mastering speakers and going like, whoa, I don't remember this record sounding this good. And like, wow, this is really hypnotic. This is such an immersive meditation. And in hindsight, what I was listening to for the first time in a really nice studio was one of these remasters, either 2004 or 2018. I think it's likely that it was a 2004 remaster that I probably heard. Yeah, because when I heard this, it would have been in Joe Lambert mastering way before 2018, because I stopped mastering there by 2018. So it would have been the 2004 remaster. And I remember hearing that on great mastering speakers going like, whoa, this sounds incredible. The amount of space and detail and size here. And if you hear this on great speakers, this 2004, it's like you feel like you can reach out and like caress the vocalist. It is really impressive on nice sounding speakers. And I kind of got it for the first time. But what did that to me, to a degree, was the production. And for the first time, I kind of connected with, on a physical level, this kind of meditative experience this track is trying to create. Because all it does is it rocks back and forth between two chords. But as soon as things were kind of made smoother, made bigger, made wider, made deeper, I could, on a physical level, connect with what never inspired me in the track, hearing the original 1970s master when I was a teenager. So these things can have an impact. Ideas like remastering tracks can have an impact on who's going to appreciate it, how and why. And as much as I love some old school, like 1970s James Brown records, I never want to hear be remastered because they should sound exactly how they sound. There are certain records where this wild departure and reimagining from how it originally sounded can make audiences connected with it more. And I think that one of the reasons this comes up as a sonic reference for people to this day is because they really like the sound of the 2004 remaster. It's really impressive. And it made them notice how good the song sounds for the first time. And I think if we only ever had the 1976 version, that people would not be using this as a reference for me today on like how they want the records to sound. And this is a tricky thing because I'm the kind of guy when, they remastered Star Wars, I was like, no, I want my original VHS version of Star Wars. I don't want to see your new heightened graphics. I don't want any of that remastering. You're making it so clear that now I can actually see the box around the starships. Like, this doesn't work. Don't do this to me. Oh, and you're going to add scenes? You're going to take out the guns in E.T. and replace them with walkie-talkies? Like, what are we doing? And I think that kind of thing is often way too far for me. Like, I generally don't want to hear remixes of tracks. But a really good remaster, even if it doesn't sound like the original, I'll kind of go for it. Let me know what you guys think, what your favorite version of this is. And Green Lounge here is writing in to say, this is about a song and performance, a snapshot in time. But that's the funny thing is, it's not. People who listen to this record today are not listening to a snapshot in time. They're listening to a record where in the 1970s, they took an 8-bar loop of the drummer, who probably couldn't actually play the whole thing in time for the entire session because he was out of his mind on the white stuff. They took an 8-bar loop and doctored the heck out of this thing. Some of the stories I've read about the kinds of things that were going on in making this record, to my understanding, at a certain point, they had recorded over the master tape so many times that the drum sounds had become like totally veiled. And they had to bring someone in to try to transfer the kick and snare sounds from an older version of it onto the master that they were working with. It's some crazy story where they had to actually almost sample replace their own drums using tape. And it was really hard to do because tapes almost always don't play back at the same speed. So they were trying to get another performance of some of the drums onto their master tape so they could have a cleaner performance, almost like resampling their drums in the analog way that they could at that time. And to my understanding, the first 8 days that they were recording this thing, they were having a terrible time getting good sounds. And then all of a sudden, the producers got so annoyed that they spent 10 minutes turning every single knob up in the studio. And then all of a sudden, the record sounded good. They turned every EQ knob up to 12. And they're like, okay, now it sounds good. There's so much doctoring happening here. It is not a snapshot in a performance in time. And it's not a snapshot of what things were like in the 1970s either, because most people hearing this record today are hearing either the 2004 remaster or the 2018 remaster. And it sounds almost nothing like especially the 2004, sounds almost nothing like the original. And would this record still be as big if none of those remasters were ever made? Would it still be used as a sonic reference? I don't know. I don't know that it would. But that said, again, I could see this 2004 being too heavy-handed and some people preferring the 2018 over the 2004. But I find it hard to imagine anyone preferring today as a modern listener. If I just gave people all three level matched, are most people going to pick this one? Compared to This is respectful remaster, I think.
Say when they
Or,
would come and they would go.
and more accurately,
When the rain washes you clean, you know. You know.
so we focus on a few major things here. The idea of these tracks kind of taking turns where sometimes the guitar is the most prominent thing and sometimes it's not. Where the vocal is allowed to dip in and out of A tier. On the original mixes of this, the fact that the kick drum is allowed to be subservient to the bass, and the bass is allowed to be bigger and deeper than the kick. In the 2004, they really do try to make the kick and bass kind of be on equal footing, and that's one of the most impressive things in the 2004. But that's not what's happening in the original mix. The mixers are allowing the bass to kind of win over the kick. I'm really annoyed at myself right now because I'm realizing I wasn't sharing my screen the entire time here. There were some moments where you have just been seeing my face while I was flipping between these. But let me do one last flip through between these three versions, just for those of you who weren't able to see me flipping through them while we were listening to the differences. Here it is one more time, going from the past to the future. Original. (2018). 2004.
Now here you go again. You say you want your freedom. Well, who am I to keep you down?
And now with level matching off. Original. 2018. 2004. Ah. The width, the scooping in the mid-range, it just sounds like so much more like a contemporary record. Like if this record was made today, this 2004 version is kind of what it would sound like. And to my understanding, that's not a remix, that's a remaster. Very impressive work. All right, I hope this one was useful to you. Let me know if you have different thoughts, different ideas about what sounds good here, or different things that you noticed in the mix. Big thing that you can do here is if you want to have much better results on your own mixes, I think one of the best things you can do is really listen to your mixes in the context of what great records actually sound like. And that's something we do in our member section constantly. If you go to members.sonicscoop.com, you can get any of our full-length courses there. But we can also take this approach on your own records, where we can listen to together your record compared to a whole bunch of your favorite records and just figure out what the differences are. Do you have as much low end as the average of all your favorite records? Do you have as much snare drum as the average of your favorite records? Are you mixing vocals way hotter or way less hot? Are you using reverbs that are way too long or not enough pre-delay or way too bright compared to the average of your favorite records? This is something we can discern really quickly. We do mixed feedback sessions every other week, and I listen to these tracks with you. And not only do you get to learn from your tracks, but from the mistakes and successes of others as well. It's a really great environment. Check it out over at members.sonicscoop.com. Or while you're there, check out any one of our great full-length courses like Mixing Breakthroughs, Mastering Demystified, Compression Breakthroughs, EQ Breakthroughs. They'll change the way you work forever for the better, guaranteed, or your money back. Shout out and thanks also to Sound Toys, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe. The super plate here is an absolutely great reverb for trying to get this kind of sound. You got to check out Sound Toys, and don't be shy when it comes to things like using the built-in EQ on super plate to take a whole bunch of high frequency and low end off of your reverb returns. And don't be afraid to use the pre-delay to extend the length of your reverb without making your reverb longer. All right. Shout out and thanks to you for being here. Remember to hit like and subscribe. notifications bell, all the good stuff. Thanks for hanging out with me. It's been Justin Coletti of Sonic Scoop. See you next time.